The Viking Age began in the late 8th century with the attacks in 793 on Lindisfarne. The sacking of the St. Cuthbert Church sent fear throughout the Christian kingdoms. The Viking raids on Western Europe and their martial influence in the Eastern Europe are generally the Viking Era's focus points. This lecture will cover 3 parts of the 859 expeditions, a brief history of the Iberian Peninsula, Bjorn and Hastein, then a dive into the Mediterranean expedition, followed by evidence that Bjorn and Hastein sacked Greece along with the great metropolis of Alexandria. During the Viking Age, the Iberian Peninsula was mainly inhabited by Muslim forces and Muslim culture. This dates to the end of the 7th century and the rise of the Umayyad dynasty. In 661, the Umayyads had risen to power in Damascus and quickly became one of the most potent military forces to exist. Their conquest promptly expanded into the west, and by the mid-670s, North Africa had been overrun. By the year 711, the Umayyads had become the first Muslim troops to push across the Gibraltar Straits. Within 5 years, almost all of Iberia was under Muslim control. The remains of the Visigoth kingdom had retreated to the northeast, and the Christian realm of the Asturias, led by Alfonso I, had been pushed back into the northern mountains. However, the far extent of the Umayyads was not forever. In 750, a disastrous coup led by the Persians split the Umayyad Caliphate, killing almost every dynasty member and giving rise to the new Abbasid Caliphate. The sole survivor of the Umayyad dynasty, Prince Abd al-Rahman, had fled from North Africa across Gibraltar into southern Iberia. Seeking refuge in Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman recollected his Muslim forces and attacked the Islamic governor Yusuf al-Fihri, establishing his emirate under the name Al-Andalus. Cordoba, the emirate's capital, had quickly risen to become a metropolis for learning sciences and culture, most likely due to the refugees of the Abbasid Revolution. The earliest recorded Viking raids on the Iberian Peninsula are dated to 844. However, this fleet's leaders are unknown, and their rough defeats could explain why it took 15 years to return. According to the Annals of Saint Bertrand, the initial attacks on Iberia were in the north, on the Christian kingdom of Galicia. However, they were driven away by bad weather and missiles launched from the defense. After being met with such resistance, the Vikings regrouped and headed south, where they had much more success, sacking Lisbon on August 20th with little resistance. From Lisbon, the Vikings pushed up the Guadalquivir River and began to sack the city of Seville on October 3rd. At this point, most likely because of how close the Vikings were approaching Cordoba, the emir Abd al-Rahman II sent an army to attack the Vikings. According to contemporary Muslim sources, more than 1,000 Scandinavians were killed and 30 ships were destroyed. This brutal defeat is believed to be why the Vikings would not return for a century and a half. However, the men who would return would go down in history as some of the most notorious and prestigious Vikings. Bjorn Ironside is believed to have been born sometime at the beginning of the 9th century to the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the Norman history of William of Jumièges, Bjorn, under the command of his father, had led a fleet of Danish Vikings to pillage and raid the river systems of West Francia. Bjorn, son of Lothbrok, king of Dacia, was driven out of his homeland, according to custom, with Hastings, its governor. Sometime in the winter of 857, Bjorn constructed a settlement on the island of Oisel, a stronghold which he protected for many years, successfully defending off the forces of Charles the Bald in 858. As for Hastein, a lot less is known about his early life. It is unknown if he had commanded his own fleet or worked with Bjorn during the raids on West Francia. It is argued that Hastein was still a child when he began the attacks. However, it is safe to assume that Hastein participated in much of the pillaging. Hastein would use his power and prestige to solidify his history following the Great Expedition of 859. In their conquest for prestige and wealth, the great fleet which Bjorn Ironside and Hastein would lead departed from Loire with 62 ships, a large size although smaller than the fleet which raided Iberia in 844. Their goals, however, would be much more audacious than the last fleet: to sack the city of Rome. Like those who would raid before them in 844, Bjorn and Hastein were met with heavy resistance from Galician and Austrian forces. Pushing further south, the Vikings would enter the Guadalquivir in Al-Andalus, successfully sacking the Mosque of Seville and burning it to the ground. The new emir, Muhammad I, would send an army to counter their attacks any further up the river, pushing the Vikings back down the river and into open sea. Despite the relatively disappointing Al-Andalus and northern Iberian attempts, Hastein and Bjorn would choose to continue moving east, attacking Cadiz and Algeciras along the way. Passing through the Gibraltar Straits sometime in the autumn of 859, marking the first Vikings ever to enter the Mediterranean from the west. While in the Mediterranean, Hastein and Bjorn would find much more success than they did along the eastern coast, first landing their ships on the coast of North Africa, sacking Nakor, where they would stay for at least a week. Crossing back over the sea and into Al-Andalus, they pillaged Andalusia and Murcia. Heading north along the coast, they sacked plenty of settlements along Valencia before heading towards the Balearic Islands, sacking the islands of Ibiza, Majorca, and Minorca. From here, the fleet headed northeast towards the southern Frankish territory, attacking and pillaging the monasteries and towns in Roussillon before raising Narbonne. The fleet would then head to the marshes of Camargue to set up camp for the winter. Come spring of 860, Bjorn and Hastein have decided to push up the Rhone River. Here they would successfully sack Nimes and Arles before continuing on to Valence. This is where the Vikings would meet the most resistance they have seen since entering the Mediterranean. With the Viking mentality to continue pushing east and looting elsewhere, they chose to pull back from the river and into the open sea. They continued to sail south until they found the city of Luni, which they had mistaken for Rome. Upon landing their vessels, Hastein quickly decided that the town was too fortified for the Vikings to overrun and devised a plan. He sent 2 Viking emissaries to the city's gates to notify the locals that their chief was ill and dying. Upon returning a few days later, the Viking emissaries told the locals that their chief had died and requested a proper Christian burial. To this, the Christians agreed. The Vikings followed their chieftain's coffin to their funeral, at which point Hastein burst from the coffin, slaying the bishop. Among the havoc, the Vikings had gained access to the city and began to pillage Luni. However, the legitimacy of this story has come into question by many historians and is most likely an example of Dudo of St. Quentin's legendary writing style. Nevertheless, the Vikings continued south, sacking Pisa and then upstream the river Arno, sacking Fiesole. At this point, we lose sources containing the fleet's location, and I will examine what happened in that missing year later. However, the fleet appears in Muslim sources once again in the year 861. According to Ibn Hayyan, the Vikings attempted to come back through the Straits of Gibraltar in their attempt to sail home. This attempt ended in havoc and flames for the Vikings, with only 20 ships of the 60 reported to have made it through. The Gibraltar Strait is only 9 miles wide, and for a fleet of that size to pass through unnoticed was almost impossible. As well, the Emir of Al-Andalus, Muhammad I, had been waiting for their return, and their fleet was ambushed and bombarded with Greek fire, Muslim artillery that would represent modern-day napalm. Gibraltar Straits also have a super strong current flowing into the Mediterranean Sea, which the Vikings had to counter, essentially slowing them to a crawl. Upon suffering such a great loss, in Viking fashion, they decided to pull off one more raid before returning home. This raid would end up being one of the most successful of the entire expedition. Traveling north along the eastern Iberian coast, the Vikings sacked the city of Pamplona and captured their king, King Garcia I. The Vikings would then ransom King Garcia for a whopping 70,000 gold dinars. Surely all the 20 ships that returned to the Loire had been brimmed with gold, and the men who returned in 862 were filthy rich. A debate that continues today is what happened to the fleet in the year 860-861. As recently presented with evidence by historian Anne Christie's, it is most likely that the Vikings either overwintered in Francia for 2 winters, or pushed past Rome and instead expanded further south into the realms of Byzantium and Alexandria before returning home. Based on a plethora of Arabic sources and historians, such as the works of Ibn Hayyan, Ibn Hadaribayan, and Ahmed al-Razi, in collaboration with the Frankish source of the Chronicle of Alfonso III, it would not be too inaccurate to assume that these men also helped the Rus Vikings who sacked Constantinople in 860. Ibn al-Qutiyah's accounts conflate the expeditions of 844 and 849, however, this is what he wrote. Then they ravaged the 2 coasts completely until they reached the lands of the Byzantines in Alexandria. And according to the chronicles of Alfonso III, they then sailed to Greece and finally returned to their own country 3 years later. While Christie's makes it clear that the evidence is feeble with almost 0 contemporary sources to provide more proof of these raids, with the lack of evidence it is hard to dissect it any further, for it is a legendary story of a legendary expedition.